Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. It's such a pleasure today to be here with a man who I've heard so much about and who I got to speak for the first time, see speak for the first time at the Democratic Party Labor Day barbecue. I want to talk about that event too, but the buzz is all around Ricardo Valencia, my guest today, candidate for 5th District, Santa Barbara County Supervisor, an opportunity to make a dramatic shift in representation there. Three candidates in the race, but we're here today with Ricardo. What an honor. Thanks for taking time. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm so blessed that I have the privilege of being a teacher, right, in my hometown community. That was my goal when I was a 10th grader. Since I was a 10th grader at Santa Maria High School, actually, it's so interesting that we're connected. That you're in Santa Barbara because I would attend conferences at UCSB, events called the Raza College Day, where Latino high school students would recruit us to go to the UCSB for the day and inspire us to want to go to college and to help our community. And so when I was a 10th grader in high school, I would start to go to these conferences. And that's what inspired me to be a teacher. They said, hey, like you can really make a difference by becoming an educator, getting involved in your community. Originally, I wanted to be like go into international business because I wanted to be a multimillionaire, be rich. Growing up in poverty, I think kind of sometimes lends itself to that. But now that I'm an educator, I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of youth and family now who have hopefully had access to better education, better quality of life. So I do consider myself a multimillionaire in that regard because hopefully I've opened up some doors to more communities that are overlooked, undermined. And so I feel great because this campaign has continued to allow me to talk to our community and advocate for the issues that are impacting our families. And so thankfully, I'm doing quite well, even though campaigns are quite difficult and quite exhausting. We're interviewing, we're podcasting, we're fundraising, but the response has been so wonderful so far. Like, I didn't realize that as a teacher, that even though I did this to serve my community without expecting, something in return, I didn't realize how much my community would want to return the favor, if you will, and be there for me and knock on doors and donate. So I'm just very humbled that my community has been so responsive to our message.
That's great, Ricardo. So I want to go back in time because the first time that I interacted with you, I was covering the Santa Barbara County Democratic Labor Day barbecue. So this was way back in September. And I cover that every year. And, it's kind of a routine event. It's like a cool event. And occasionally some of the speakers, they'll get a little more attention. And I was struck by your speech. You were impactful and you came out hot, as they say. You weren't pulling any punches in terms of your comment. So I just want to say, like that was the first time that I became familiar with you, and you were sort of talking about why you were a local candidate. You look like the district, and you had made comments about how the other one of the other candidates, Corey Bantolin, was sort of looking to inherit the seat because he's the chief of staff of the current supervisor. So from a journalist point of view, it's like, wow, this guy's going to be very quotable. This guy says what's on his mind. So talk to me, Ricardo. Like, why should voters elect you? What's special? What's unique? What's different about you and your candidacy?
Think what it's funny you go back to that moment, right? Because to me it's a bit insulting that candidates can just move into a district to be able to run right before it's time to run for the election. And that's why I called one of my opponents their opposer at that event, because growing up on the block, when somebody claims to be from the neighborhood and they're not, we call those people posers. And so I thought that epitomized kind of the approach, unfortunately, of one of my opponents, where literally just months ago he moved into the district so that he could run for this position. Well, that's different from myself. I've lived in this district since 1997, and I've been a homeowner in this district since 2011. So this is home for me. One of my other opponents, since I have two opponents, they also just moved into the district a couple of months ago to be able to run as a candidate in this position. And to me, it's like, representation should be authentic. And so if you don't even want to like live in the neighborhood that you're supposed to represent, then why should the community trust you? And I'm really honored that my community actually encouraged me to run. So this is not something that I did because, I've been planning for it for years. You know how some candidates, they run for student government in high school and then they, want to become city council members and then they want to become, the next level. That hasn't been my journey. My journey has been one where my community has asked me to step up into leadership. So they asked me to run for school board during the pandemic. And quite frankly, I didn't know if I had the ability to do so because I want to serve my community well. But I questioned myself whether I could be effective there. But my community said, "No, Ricardo, we believe in you. We see you standing up for working families as a teacher. We see how hard you fight so that our families get treated with justice, respect, more job opportunities." And so that's been my journey into leadership, and that's why I ran for school board. In 2020 during the pandemic, right? I don't run from challenges. I think I lean into them because my community asked me to protect our students. And that campaign was amazing because, the first time I ran in 2020, it was unopposed, right? But then when I ran for school board just a year and a half ago, there was a hardcore MAGA candidate that ran against me that was supported by the mayor of Santa Maria. And they're moms for liberty type of candidates. These are folks that don't want our kids to learn anything about diversity, equity, inclusion. And I feel really proud that we were able to win by 70% of the vote in that election because I had 40 different high school students that were a part of my team, about 30 different community members who said, no, we value something different in this community. We do value diversity, we do value inclusion, and we want to resist the hatred and discrimination that is coming from our federal government. We know right now what the Trump administration is doing in terms of tearing our families apart. And so, I think that's why my community voted me the North County Leader of the Year, is because they said, Ricardo, we see you standing up for families, and we want you to take your leadership to the next level. And that's why I'm running for supervisor, because my community has asked me to step up. I'm not the type of person that's like, hey, pick me. I'm the leader, like choose me, right? It actually took a lot of convincing from many different leaders in this community. But once I got that phone call from multiple leaders that I trust and respect, that's when I finally began to take that question seriously. And if what I've learned is that I tell my students this all the time when, because I believe in them. I tell them, hey, I want you to run for mayor. I want you to run for governor because we need people with good hearts and good minds. But I would be a hypocrite if I didn't take that advice for myself. And so when good people believe in you, believe them. And so that's what I've done so far. And that's why I'm running for supervisor.
Yeah, you got to treat yourself at least as good as you treat others, right? You've got
Absolutely.
to, you can't take care of other people if you can't take care of yourself.
Absolutely.
I want to talk to you a little bit about your opponents in a second, but from an analytical perspective, this would be a huge shift. A Democrat, a Latino, a Mexican American serving in this district, big switch from the current and previous office holder. Ricardo, can you talk a little bit about your story? I know that you grew up Santa Maria, Guadalupe.
Yes.
You have talked about not having a lot of inherited wealth growing up poor.
Yes.
I think these are the kind of things voters want to know about you. They want to know what you've been through because it shows what you've overcome and how you can relate and identify to other people in the community in the district. So, can you talk a little bit about your personal story and how'd you grow up and how did you sort of join sort of this political world?
Absolutely. I would consider myself a survivor of Reaganomics in the 80s, meaning I was born in 1983. My parents are undocumented, right? Both of them were undocumented at one point in their lives. And then thankfully over the time were able to gain their citizenship. And my parents, they have a sixth grade level education. My father hails from Michoacan, in Mexico, and my mother hails from Jalisco, in Mexico. And I've had the privilege of visiting both of these places once as a family, because unfortunately, like we couldn't afford to take like yearly trips, on vacation. Sometimes when a family member gets sick, right, that's when people go, to visit family. We were able to do that once when I was in fifth grade, but it planted seeds in me that made me so proud to come from the roots that I do. Because where my father comes from, it's a small little ranchito where there's cows and there's corn. There's roads that are with dirt roads with rocks, no skyscrapers, no McDonald's, no big box stores. And so being a fifth grader and meeting my indigenous grandmother, who still spoke some of her indigenous tongue. We're the Purepecha people in Michoacan. We are people that actually resisted imperialism, not just from the Spaniards, but even from the Aztecs who wanted to control, right, surrounding territories. And so those little seeds of going to my roots have made me so proud of where I come from. And it's given me not just pride, but also like the desire for other people to like embrace Latino and Mexican American culture. Because, if you knew those people that don't know about our culture, they would love us if they knew more about us, right? We contribute so much to this economy, right? We are we are the folks in the kitchens, we are the folks in the fields, we are the folks, doing the cleaning in the homes, taking care of children. And so coming from a humble background like that has led me to connect with so many of our students and families who also come from similar working class communities. My mother, my mother's a seamstress. That's the career that she inherited from my grandmother. And I'll never forget, as a teenager in high school, my mother would work full time with minimum wage jobs, wasn't a union worker, so she doesn't have the benefits and the protections that I have. And after a full day's work, she'd be on the sewing machine in the garage, vroom, 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 that sewing machine sound. It's forever in my mind because while I would be doing homework in my room, my mother would be in the garage continuing to sew. And so I think part of what's important for me is honoring my roots because we struggled economically. We dealt with food insecurity. I remember those government boxes with cereal that were in black and white and the government cheese. Um, and I used to be embarrassed by that. I used to be embarrassed by that because when we would go to the grocery store, we would stand in line and then I would be looking around when it was time to pay, and my mother would pull out those food stamps. Back in the day, it wasn't EBT cards like we have today, right?
Right.
It was
Everybody knew. Yeah.
yeah, and so that means everybody could see, right, that you were poor. And now what I realize is, I'm actually embarrassed that I was embarrassed. In other words, I'm a little bit ashamed that I was ashamed. And what I mean by that is, we should be embarrassed that multi-billion-dollar corporations are subsidized, right, instead of subsidizing working class families. So my parents were working full time. I could still barely afford sometimes to put food on the table, and it had nothing to do with their character and everything to do with our economy, right, and the politics of society, which unfortunately would rather enhance the wealth of corporations, invest in things like war, right, instead of investing in working class communities. And so and something else that I think is important for the community to know is, being raised in Guadalupe, we didn't have like a Boys and Girls Club when I was there at the time. Thankfully we do now. When I was raised there in the early 90s, I later learned that it was one of the most economically depressed areas in the country. And I learned this when I was reading an article as a student at UC Berkeley. And then things began to make sense. It made more sense why so many of my friends, turned to gangs, turned to drugs. When I was a fifth grader, I was going in that trajectory because my sisters were cholas, my sisters were homegirls on the block. And what's ironic is that my sisters originally were into like dance and drill team, because I was born in East LA. I was born there, but when I was 6 years old, that's when we moved to Guadalupe, starting my first grade. And ironically, my parents moved us out of LA, right, so that we wouldn't turn to the gang life, we wouldn't turn to drugs. But because there wasn't much to do in Guadalupe at the time, that's when my sisters turned to that. And what I think is important to know that is my sisters, they went to school to Rigetti High School, which at the time was predominantly white. And unfortunately, many of the students and even many of the teachers that my sisters had, they didn't always embrace my sisters. I think they judged the book by its cover, and they assumed that because my sisters dressed like gang members, that they were not, that they were up to no good and that they were like, on the wrong path. And my path was different. At Santa Maria High School, I had teachers that invested in me, Unfortunately, I wish I did have more that told me that you could go to college, but I had enough counselors and teachers that said, hey, Ricardo, you can go to college. And that has changed my trajectory all my life. So in other words, people have invested in me, and I'm just trying to, return that to my community.
So did you grow up in apartment, or what was your sort of situation? We talk about food insecurity, and I just think it's interesting because I grew up food stamps, when I was a kid, and I'm a little bit older than you, but I remember that whole thing, and I remember the shame of it, and is anyone going to see me here? And obviously you you break the cycle, so to speak, and so like my kids are in a much better situation than I was, and that's what we want, right? We're growing up, we're like, someday
Yeah,
we're going to make this different
absolutely.
for our kids. But talk to me a little bit. Did you have trouble in school? What was it like for you, specifically as you can, that you feel comfortable with? Because people hear you had a rough upbringing, but they may not know what that means. Like, talk a little about specifically you.
Sure. It's interesting because when you're around mostly folks that are working class, I'm so proud to be from Guadalupe, because it's, a very working class community, a lot of farm workers, right? Has a deep history of diversity of Native Americans and Mexican Americans and Japanese Americans, and which history that I learned a little later in life. But it's a very humble community when I was there in the 90s. And, so I didn't really realize that I was poor until I like left, in different surroundings. Even in Santa Maria, I grew up in a working class community by Oakley School, with working class folks all around me. I was lucky that it was kind of a diverse community, a little bit of like black families, Salvadorian families, Mexican families, white families. But it was hard, because again, we didn't have enough all the time to be able to like, take care of our basic needs. I remember as in high school, I would refrain sometimes from going to the chiropractor because I did sports in high school. I did cross country, I did wrestling and track, but sometimes I'd get some injuries and I would worry that my parents didn't have the money to afford the chiropractor. And I'm lucky that, occasionally a teacher or, an adult in my life, right, would say, "Hey, Ricardo, like you should take care of that and I'll take you." And so I had the privilege of that. But I remember like in fifth grade, because I had cousins also that were gang members, in Santa Maria. And I looked up to them just like I looked up to my sisters. And so I started using drugs at a young age. In fifth grade, I started experimenting with marijuana as a fifth grade kid, right? I wanted to fit in, right? I wanted to be cool. And but then I realized, by consuming that stuff, I was like, oh snap, this is affecting like my, how I'm doing in school. I was doing decently, right? A's and B's, but I noticed started to notice like a decline in that. And I remember the heartache, that my parents would go through, right? Because, my sister Claudia, excuse me, Erica, my elder sister, she would work in Guadalupe at the Far Western when the Far Western Tavern was in Guadalupe as opposed to an Orchid. And she was expected, to contribute a significant portion of her paycheck to help the family survive. That's kind of like the cultural expectation, right? Very different, right, than some of our youth who are able to just use that money, right, for, whatever extra expenses they want. And
Car, yeah.
yeah, and so I remember, the heartache, right? And then my sister, being, in the gang, sometimes she'd be kicked out of the house, right, for using the drugs or for not coming home, and the heartache that caused our family. And we didn't have the resources, right? We didn't have the rehabs, that upper middle class folks have access to, or that I would have access to today, if So, I think a lot of folks who don't understand poverty make the mistake of assuming that it's a character flaw, as opposed to understanding how there's so many institutional barriers that limit the progress of working class people. And that's a big part of the reason why I'm running, right? Is our workers are struggling to survive. I was in Guadalupe just recently and I spoke to a member of the community that's making $16, $17 an hour. Right. How is she going to feed herself and her family on those wages? I talked to a single father raising a son with disabilities, paying $2,300 a month for rent in Guadalupe, right?
Ooh,
And I remember him describing to me after a hard day's work, he's like, "Hey, I made $250 today. I'm so proud that I'm able to, try to feed my family." But I thought to myself, my goodness, like our community deserves better. And we can do better. We're one of the richest. First of all, California is what, the fourth largest economy in the world now, approximately. We're one of the richest nations in the world. How can there be poverty? How can there be homelessness, and job insecurity in a place with so much wealth? So I hope that this campaign inspires people, right, to have more empathy for our working families and to appreciate the labor that they contribute to our county. Farm workers, for example, right, are often making close to minimum wage and they're struggling. Right? I see it with my students, right? Many of my students are forced to work, instead of joining clubs and joining sports, right, or getting involved, they have to work sometimes to be able to make ends meet for their family. So I see economic development as a really critical piece to this campaign so that we could help everybody have a chance at the American dream.
great. Yeah, that's well said. You're a candidate, so you're probably not going to mention your opponent's names, but I will. Um, I had Corey Bantalin on the show, and I hope to have Maribel Aguilera Hernandez as well with some scheduling issues, but I hope to have her as well. but I had Corey, and I threw the question at him. I said, "When did you move to the district?" And he said, "Well, last summer or something like that." But, his answer was, "I've worked in this district for, I don't know, a decade or longer, a long time. And, he knows the issues. He's invested in the issues. And so your residential address is less important than the fact that this has been his professional life for a long time. And, he's worked with a lot of these people already as chief of staff." Can you talk, Ricardo, about the difference between something being your professional work and being knowledgeable about it as he is, as opposed to your situation? Like when voters are trying to think, I really like Ricardo, he's from the community, and then they're like, but Corey's been there, like he knows how this works. Like, make the case for why your situation is more valuable.
Absolutely. Well, that opponent has never been an elected official in this community. And I have since 2020 and during the pandemic. So when we talk about qualifications, right, for being an elected official, I've been doing that, right, for over 5 years. And unfortunately, in his capacity, he has not. In addition to that, it's different when say you work for the community for a paycheck, but it's different when you've actually gone to the schools of this community, right? Where you work on a daily basis, like I have with thousands of our families, right? As a school board member and as a teacher, it's a difference when you know those issues and you feel them personally, right? My lived experience is more directly connected to the families here than that candidate. You had also talked about earlier, right, the representation issue, right? So this area was redistricted a couple of years ago to enhance the prospects, right, of having a diverse candidate that reflects the community. Over 70% of Santa Maria is of Latino descent. That is a community I'm proud to be a part of. But because of my background in ethnic studies, right, I studied African American history, Asian American history, Native American history. I studied like basically how to build coalitions, how to bring people together. So professionally, I've done that all my life. And more importantly, I've practiced it here in this community. And so for me, that's why it's insulting, right? To have like outsiders to the community claim to say, "Hey, like I can be the person that solves your problems." Well, how do you know that when you haven't even lived here in our community? And furthermore, even though they've been in that position for approximately 15 years, like very few people in this community know who he is because he's just not connected. I mean, this person lived in Lompoc, right? And then grew up in Santa Barbara and things like that. And so, I respect any opponent that puts themselves out there, right? Because I know how challenging it can be. But let's stick to the facts. And the facts are that you're not from here and you didn't grow up here and you have less lived experiences connected to the daily realities of our families. And so for me, it's critical that representation be authentic and not be convenient. All of a sudden it's time to run for office, and now we're seeing candidates out there. Me, no, I show up, especially when it's not campaign season.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so the top two will make it through June,
Yes.
right? Unless somebody gets 50.1, which is extraordinarily unlikely in this contest with three viable candidates. Um, from the fundraising, Maribel Aguilera Hernandez was number one, right? So she had raised the most money, and that sort of surprised some people. And Corey was sort of at the bottom. Um, do you see like one of them as more of a challenge than the other? Because if you sort of slice and dice this, Corey's the insider candidate, but as far as like maybe more of the traditional Republicans or maybe more behind Maribel, and there's more money, and so what can you say to distinguish yourself from her candidacy, beyond sort of the partisan part of it?
Absolutely. And so, what's unfortunate is that part of the reason, why, my opponent has more money at this point, or at least we'll see what happens in the next filing period, right, which is coming up soon, is because they're taking money from special interests and from big corporations. And including Sable, right? So you had mentioned, Maribel just a moment ago, and so she is now beginning to distance herself from some of that oil money. And I think it's because a campaign like ours is not taking any money from corporate donors or special interests. This is a people-powered campaign. And so that means we will not be bought. by corporate sponsors, if you will, right? AKA people that contribute to these campaigns. And so I think that's a major distinguishing factor is she's accepting money from some far right groups, right? That are going to continue to be the status quo in terms of trying to perpetuate more conservative values in this community. But this campaign represents something different. We present a progressive campaign. One of my opponents described me as far left, and I would disagree with that. I'm a progressive candidate. That means that I care about moving our country and our county forward. That means I care about women's rights. I care about LGBT rights. I care about working families, right? I care about bringing people together. I care about not having our families torn apart by ICE. Those are just like humane issues to me. And so it's unfortunate that, we have these kind of boxes sometimes in politics, but I understand that it's important to distinguish ourselves. And same thing, you had mentioned, Mr. Bansalon just a moment ago, he, says he aligns 95%, with our current supervisor for District 5, Mr. Labjanino, and they're Republicans essentially, right? But Mr. Bansalon is running as an independent, and so is Maribel. And so I think they want to play both sides, right? They want to get votes from Democrats, they want to get votes from Republicans. But my campaign, I'm up front. I've been proudly endorsed by the Santa Barbara County Democratic Party. I'm the only candidate that can say that. I'm also the only candidate that has been endorsed by the Working Families Party, which means that no matter what your political persuasion, I'm about working families, and working families exist throughout the political spectrum, whether you're to the left, the middle, or to the right. And so I would proudly represent, those perspectives. And, I have success, as a school board member. I don't always agree with some of my board colleagues, right? We also have different political views. But thankfully, I'm able to effectively come together with my board colleagues to improve the education of our young people. So I have experience doing that. I'm also the only candidate that has the most individual contributions than anybody in this race. That means that regular people, teachers, firefighters, students, regular working class folks have contributed to this campaign. Some of them have contributed $5. Some of them have contributed $20. I've had the privilege of also folks that, have means, right, that have been able to contribute a couple of thousand, but none of my donations come from those corporate special interests. And that's a major distinguishing factor for me compared to my opponents.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So clarify, Maribel, not a Republican, but conservative. I should make that distinction because they get all worked up about the R word when it comes election time. Okay. Conservative,
Well, let's
but
clarify something.
not
Let's clarify something there, because she has been endorsed by the mayor of Santa Maria, and the mayor of
okay.
Santa Maria brought us the ICE facility that we have here today. Santa Maria is the only place in Santa Barbara County that has that ICE facility. Way before, in 2014, 2015, I showed up to the city council and told, the mayor and the city council, do not bring an ICE facility to this community. And look at what it's doing in terms of tearing our families apart. We know that places like Santa Maria and Santa Barbara, right, are seeing some major, right, ICE activity there, harming our families. And, so that's what separates me from my opponents is they haven't been speaking out about this immigration issue. Now that it's become a bit more popular to do so, some candidates are starting to share a little bit more about where they stand, but nothing substantive. For example, at the city council, I walked with students, as an adult ally. At the high school, some of our high school students, they walked out, right, of their high school to protest, right, what was happening with their families being deported and torn apart. I escorted the students, and I didn't see, unfortunately, any police escort the way that the students had requested. So thankfully, I was able to help keep our young people safe. They showed up to the city council a year ago and said, hey, protect our families, invest resources and legal aid to protect us. And it was silence. So unfortunately, my opponent Maribel had the chance for over a year to invest resources and energy, create an ad hoc committee, but she didn't. And that's what separates me from her is that I've been doing this work. I've been advocating for our immigrant families, not just when it's campaign season.
Okay. Let's transition into some of the issues, and we'll just start right there with ICE and in your role potentially as a supervisor, you would have more interaction with Sheriff Bill Brown. Of course, there's lots of conversation, there's criticism. How much is the sheriff working with ICE? Is it over? Is it something that's more passive? Does it exist at all? Clearly, that there's awareness of some people when they get out of the jail that they're undocumented. So, How does that happen? If elected, what will you do to address this issue to help families to stop deportations of people who are, in jail for minor crimes? Who it's against the law to deport them unless they commit certain kind of crimes, but it doesn't happen that way. They're just getting deported. What will you do to sort of address this issue with ICE in our communities?
I would continue to push for holding the sheriff accountable, right? As a board member, I took a sacred oath, right, to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And unfortunately, our sheriff, Mr. Brown, is not doing so, right? He's not adhering to that protection of our constitutional rights. And people have these rights, whether they're citizens or not, right? People have protections in our country. That's what makes us a democracy. And unfortunately, Mr. Brown is not adhering to that. And so I would work with my supervisor colleagues to bring resources, legal aid, right? Because we know that when our immigrant families have access to immigration services, lawyer services, they're less likely to be deported. I think we should hold the sheriff accountable to make sure that he's following the law, right? Because we have masked agents, right, showing up to our community, tearing our families apart, not being identified. And so I think it's essential that, as challenging as it may be, that we expect that even our sheriff is not above the law, right? Nobody is above the law in our country. And, I want to make sure that not a single cent of our local taxpayer dollars are used to collaborate, with the sheriff. I've also heard reports of even like ICE, vehicles on county property. But I know of other, areas in our state that have been passing policies to ensure, right, that no property from the county, right, is used to support ICE activity. And I think the majority of the people in our county want to do the right thing, right? I think our sheriff deputies want to do the right thing. I think our police, our fire, our teachers, right? I think the majority of people are seeing this moment. And that's why we're having so many people show up to things like the No Kings protest, right? To say, hey, like this administration has gone too far, right? We shouldn't be demonizing our immigrant brothers and sisters. We should be honoring, right, the work that they do and not pretending like we don't need them. I've lived it with my own family, right, and seen how hard my parents have worked, with not always a lot in return. I see it with our students and our community members. And so I think when it comes to, the issue of ICE, you know, something I'll never forget is I read somewhere that, when the Nazis were killing our Jewish brothers and sisters, our disabled brothers and sisters during World War II, when they were killing people with disabilities, right? It wasn't because it was just the Nazis or Hitler that were doing that. It's because regular people, the people that work in our schools, regular people did not stand up to challenge this moment. And so we're seeing people in our community do so, but it's come at a great cost, right? We're seeing literally members of our community being physically attacked by ICE. We've seen American citizens being killed by ICE. And so I think in Santa Barbara County, we can set a tone where we say, this is not acceptable. We will not tolerate this in our county. And I think we could be a light for other counties throughout the country to do so. I'm the only candidate that actually signed a letter to Sheriff Brown, along with a bunch of other elected officials, such as Mr. Carbajal, I believe Ms. Monique Limon, right? A bunch of school board members, right? Many people in this community saying to the sheriff, Mr. Brown, hey, use your leadership position to, instead of attack immigrants, protect immigrants. And none of my opponents are on that letter. So that's another distinguishing factor for myself is I have a history of standing up for our immigrant communities, not just with words, but with actions.
Do you know anyone who's been deported by ICE during this cycle, during this period?
Absolutely, I have. I have families that are directly connected to me, right? I mentioned that my own parents, right, were undocumented at one point. One of my close relatives, right, was deported here in Santa Maria a few years ago. And this person, has a son, right, that was very young. But this administration does not care. It's interesting how this administration talks about family values, right? It's like kind of like a Republican talking point. But how could you be about family values if you're separating our families? And so I've lived it. In fact, to this very day, in my bones, whenever I see sometimes like ICE related vehicles or police vehicles, because we know sometimes they're collaborating, unfortunately, even though legally in California they're not supposed to. I still get, chills, right? I still feel it in my bones, that fear of my family being deported, even though I have my citizenship, right? Even though I've been a citizen, since I was born here, even though my parents are, it's a fear that doesn't leave because it's a trauma. And I think this administration is using that fear to try to stifle protests. But I think we should turn our pain into power. And that's a big part of the reason why I'm running for supervisor is I feel like we could set an environment where with policy and with action, we could create an environment where we say this is not acceptable.
In your capacity as a teacher, what is the fear? What do on the ground in schools, do you hear from your students who are very concerned about ICE's presence in the community?
Absolutely. In my classroom, I talk to students who tell me, I ask them occasionally, right, how are y'all holding up, right? Because we hear reports, right? I get some of the rapid response text messages, right, where they say ICE has been spotted in Santa Barbara, in San Ynez, in Guadalupe, in Santa Maria. And what my students tell me is that it causes great anxiety. How are they expected to focus on their studies in the classroom when they're worried about their family members being torn apart? When one of my students told me, Mr. Valencia, if one of my family members gets deported, like I'm gonna have to start working. That means I'm not gonna come to school anymore, right? I'm the only candidate that I'm aware of that has written a letter to Kristi Noem and the Trump and President Trump as a school board member with my school board team to say, hey, we do not want ICE to be operating anywhere near our schools, right? These are sensitive areas, right? In the past, they used to be respected, right? Churches and hospitals, but we're seeing under this administration how that's no longer the case. And so, our students should be focusing on their studies. They should be focusing on their clubs and their sports. But sadly, that's not happening right now. And when one of my students told me that brought chills to me is he said, Mr. Valencia, when students are living with fear and anxiety and depression, like they might do things that, that they might not normally do. And I didn't take that as a threat. I took that as a wake up call, right? That means our young people could be suicidal as a result of this. That means our young people could be caught up with drugs, right? Because they're looking for an escape to this madness. So our young people need mental health services. Our young people deserve to be protected. Our families deserve to receive the legal aid that our county can, be a part of, right? We can actually put resources. We can put direct aid so that if ICE does support our families don't, get kicked out of their apartments or their homes. These are the things that supervisors can help do to alleviate some of this mess. And people talk all the time about, we need to, support our future, and I've been doing that. That's what I've dedicated my life to as a public servant. And, what my community tells me is, well, Ricardo, now it's time for you to do it at another level where you'll be able to have influence over a $1.7 billion budget. And I'm excited about promoting things like youth internships, right, as a supervisor, as opposed to investing in things like jails, which we know are not going to help our community. We should be investing in preventative measures as opposed to, afterthoughts.
Yeah. So let's talk about issues other than, we talk about ICE, which is, of course, in the news right now and super important, and it's sort of like we're at this period where you can't really, I have a hard time listening to people who are trying to defend ICE, it's like, well, they have a job to do, but it's like we've far surpassed that when innocent people are getting shot and killed and uh, undocumented immigrants with low-level crimes are getting deported and separating from their families. It's really hard to claim family values when you are passively sort of, looking the other way with these things. But let's talk about Sable. Let's talk about some other county issues. We know that the pipes are pumping oil for the first time in what, 15 years, something like that, and the oil's being transported, and there's lawsuits locally, statewide. Trump is allowed for the oil pumping to and transportation to be resumed. What can you say about Sable and oil? You're also, you get this argument, and you're a working class guy. You know, oil is jobs too. So how do you balance the environmental concerns versus the job concerns? What is your position on this issue?
Absolutely. I join in solidarity in with my the folks that will become my colleagues as supervisors, right? The current supervisors of Santa Barbara County, are not going along with Sable polluting our environment. They've done it before, right? One of the major oil spills that has taken place here in our county is a result of corporations like this, and this is why so many folks are apprehensive, right, about trusting big oil. And unfortunately, my opponents are taking money, right, from these oil companies or from these, special interests, and now little by little beginning to distance themselves. My understanding is that one of my opponents, has actually worked for oil companies, to represent them. So literally making money for themselves to represent these interests. And I think, what's important is the majority of the people want good paying jobs, but are preferred in in green energy, right? Green energy jobs are the future. Other countries have been doing it for many, many years already, and they're ahead of us, right? Even China, right, has blown past us in terms of investing in green energy. And we're falling behind. And so and I'm very much mindful that we will not leave our working class families, unemployed, right, as a result of this dependence on oil, because there's so many other clean energy jobs that will pay as well and provide a future for their children. I've never talked to somebody who works in the industry that says, hey, like, I want to make money now because I need to feed my family, but too bad for my daughter who's going to have contaminated water and contaminated air. I've never talked to anybody that said that, right? All workers, want a better future for their children. And so, that's why I'm proud to have the support of like unions, whether it's sheet metal workers or the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the pipe fitters, for example, right? Some of these folks work in those industries, but we can create jobs, right? Good paying jobs, green energy jobs as we transition to electrical, for example, right? With our fleets, our buses, right? And so to me, those things are really important that we have these courageous conversations so that we don't leave our workers behind as we transition to green energy. And I don't think it's right that the federal government is, usurping, right, the control that the supervisors have. There's a reason why we're able to provide regulations and monitor to make sure that corporations are acting responsibly in our county. And the federal government is saying, no, we don't need to follow the law. And I think that's where we resist the law. We file the lawsuits that we need to, because I know nobody should be above the law, and these protections are in place for a reason. So I'm excited to stand with our current supervisors to challenge that activity, so that we take a stand against that.
Yeah, and along those lines, issues that you'll be dealing with is the county budget. It seems like there's always a budget shortfall. I guess county's been in, they had some good years there, but we are looking at a projected multi-million dollar shortfall. How do you balance this budget from a systematic perspective? Where should the money go? How do you make this work countywide?
We balance the budget by not balancing it on the backs of workers. I've met with SCIU workers, right, who are living in fear, right, of losing their jobs. We know that the Trump administration intentionally wanted to remove our undocumented families from having access to health care, right? And I'm so proud that in California, we have an attorney general, right, Mr. Bonta, who is, filing lawsuits, right, to say, hey, we don't have to comply with these, measures from the Trump administration. And I stood and still stand with our 805 UndocuFund, our Central Coast Labor Council, who said to the city, to the supervisors, hey, why are we preemptively considering taking our undocumented families off of, health insurance? Let's fight that. Let's resist that. And thankfully, the supervisors have done so, right? And so our undocumented families still have access to the health insurance that they deserve. And so we don't balance the budget off of the backs of workers. We do everything in our power to keep our folks employed for essential services, right? Because we're going to feel that pinch, right, if we let folks go. We have reserves, right, in this county for a reason, for rainy day. And if this ain't a rainy day, I don't know what is. And so I think tapping into those reserves is a responsible approach. I think going to the voters to say, hey, if you all are interested, right, in a sales tax increase, right, we put it to the voters and we say, hey, if you are interested in and being taxed a little bit more to protect our, our access to our health care, right, access to, good roads, right, access to good parks. If the people in this community are interested in doing that, I'm definitely open to that. We know that there's things also like grants, right, that we can tap into from the state and from the federal level to bring in more revenue into our county. And I think really importantly, I really appreciate what the Mom Downey campaign is doing in New York. So the Mom Downey campaign has created an inspector general, an auditor, or a chief savings officer, where they're meeting with department heads, they're meeting with unions, with workers, and asking, hey, you all know the budgets better than anybody because you're living in it. Where can we create where are the cost saving measures that can be created so folks don't lose their jobs and so we keep essential services? I love that idea. I know that Supervisor Joan Hartman is also talking about that, of bringing an auditor on board, because sadly, the sheriff's office budget is a big part of the reason why we're in these deficits. We're talking multi millions of dollars, and we're seeing cases of fraud at that level. And so, to me, it's important that we hold the system accountable as supervisors to make sure that our tax dollars are being spent responsibly, that there's no fraud in the system, and I think these are some of the ways that we can make sure that our budgets are not in a deficit, because we know that in the next year, it's projected for a $23 million shortfall. And in the next 5 years, a $66 million shortfall. I think we can do better. There is so much wealth and prosperity in our county, but we need to do a better job of managing that.
Santa Maria gets so much attention, certainly politically, in the media. It's the largest city in the county, even larger than Santa Barbara. But you would also represent Guadalupe, where you grew up, right? And that's a growing community, right? That's a community that is, growing in terms of population. There are questions about infrastructure and how do you accommodate this growth, and how do you grow at a rate where, the quality of life is, high and strong. And you have that experience. You spent time in there. You grew up there. Can you talk a little bit about why the people of Guadalupe should represent, or should consider you as somebody they should vote for? Because you don't really hear the issues out there come up too much, on the campaign trail.
Absolutely. The people of Guadalupe, thankfully have raised me, have invested in me. The after school programs that I was a part of as a kid. Shout out to, my teacher, Miss Patchett, my fifth grade teacher, who, poured so much love and support into so many of us growing up there. And so, one of the examples that I can share, is the theater in Guadalupe, right? The theater in Guadalupe used to be a big hub, right, for economic activity, right? Bringing in tourism, local people, right, didn't have to, travel very far, right, for entertainment. And in Lompoc, they were able to bring back, the theater in Lompoc, through the help of like matching funds and grants, thanks to the leadership of supervisors like, Joan Hartman. So I would look to examples like that are examples of successful ways to bring resources to communities like Guadalupe. Guadalupe is such a gem, like wonderful communities, wonderful restaurants, right? The city hall has murals by Judy Baca, a world-renowned Chicana muralist. We bring Grammy award-winning artists to City Hall through Viva el Arte, which I attend, every year, different concerts that are free to the community. And so I think the Guadalupe community should, vote for me, because I know the issues, because I was raised there, because I lived it, because I still have friends there, because I still frequent, the businesses and the community there. And these roots run deep. But Guadalupe has so much more untapped potential or unrealized potential. And that's why, as a supervisor, I would advocate to bring resources to this community, to bring technical assistance to our businesses, right, so that our minority-owned businesses can thrive. The work ethic is not missing. The Guadalupe people, we are scrappy people, right? We know how to work hard. We know how to build community, right? And that's what excites me about being a supervisor for Guadalupe, because this would be the first time that a supervisor that I'm aware of would represent Guadalupe the way I could, because none of the other candidates have actually lived there.
Yeah, yeah, good point. I um I know you've been knocking on doors, because I know the Democratic Party, that's the number one sort of staple of what they do is knock on doors, meet people one on one, ask them what they're interested in, and that field campaign is really the difference in my estimation. Obviously we have greater Democratic Party registration in most areas. However, it's really comes down to the work ethic. You've got to make one-to-one contact with the candidates, or I'm sorry, with the voters. Talk to me about what you've been hearing, and how many doors have you knocked on? You started early. What are people telling you at the door about the existing representation and what they would want to see from you?
Absolutely. We started knocking on doors when there was rainstorms, happening, in the community, right? That's the problem with, with global warming, right? And why it's so important to pay attention to things like oil, right? Is because our planet is getting hotter and it's leading to all these changes in our climate, right? A couple months ago, right, it's pouring rain and then it's, heat waves. And unfortunately, right, we know that the source, right, is, from things like, like oil companies that are more interested in profit than in people, but we can transition and do better. And so in terms of the campaign, when I'm knocking on doors, like we've knocked on over 4,000, 500 doors and counting. We're reaching close to 5,000 at this point, right? We have a team of over 45 students, right? High school students that have been a part of this effort. We have a team of over 40 adults, right? That are a part of this canvassing team. And I think that's indicative, right? Of like the faith, right, that my community has in seeing in me as somebody that can accurately represent them. And to me, that's a big honor, right? Because again, I didn't go into teaching, right? Because, I wanted, something in return. I wanted to give to my community, but my community has been so, wonderful, right, in doing the work, because that is how you win campaigns, is by knocking on the doors. And it's been interesting. The responses that I get from voters is they'll say things like, "Hey, like, well, you're running against, Maribel, for example," and they're like, "Yeah," and they're like, "Well, what's the difference?" And one of the things that I bring up is immigration, right? Going back to what we're talking about with ICE. Unfortunately, she's been endorsed by the mayor, right? Who, brought us the ICE facility, accepting money from, far right wing groups and corporate donors. And I said, for me, I walked with the students to the city council, right? To, fight for, our immigrant community. That was last year, right? And she was silent on that city council, with the exception of Gloria Soto, who has been a major advocate for our working class communities, somebody who I'm proud to have her endorsement. Besides Gloria Soto, it was silence in that room. And so, when I talk to voters and I bring that up, they say, yeah, you know what? I've heard the same thing. I hear that now she wants to come up with resolutions, right, in support of immigrants, but not substantive because there's no financial backing to it, right? There's no ad hoc committee. So she had a year to try to make that happen and, just didn't move on it. And so, and mind you, I actually grew up with her, right? So we actually are not enemies, right? We are quite cordial with each other, right? And so to me, it's important to stick to the facts. And I also want us to model what civil discourse looks like. You know how campaigns are known for being mudslinging and ugly and all that? On the contrary, right? I have respect for my opponents. Let's stick to the facts, right, and the issues, and that excites me, right? That we can model that here on the Central Coast. But voters are aware, right? Are paying attention to the fact that who's been showing up, right, and who is now beginning to move into the district now that it's convenient, now that it's time to run for office. And I think those are the type of issues that people are talking about. And then of course, bread and butter issues, right? Like, hey, like I'm struggling to afford my rent. I'm struggling to be able to afford to buy here in this community. That's a big part of my platform, right? Is affordability when it comes to housing. The county has access, right, to county-owned property that can be used for affordable housing, and I want to make sure that we're investing in that because, when workers are spending the majority of their paychecks to pay rent, that means they don't have the money for their healthcare access, for food, right? To take a vacation like all workers deserve, right? Basic necessities. And so I think that's why it's so important that these bread and butter issues are at the forefront. When I talk about ICE and how I'm, going to be challenging ICE activity the best I can in the community, people are, really excited about that because they see a champion, right? Willing to stand up for that. I'm gonna be, I'll be straightforward. It is scary to challenge, ICE and to challenge these things because they are attacking people. They are killing people. But I think, authentic leadership, real leadership is standing up even when things are tough. And I draw my inspiration from people that have been engaging in this fight for decades, right? We have so many civil rights leaders, right, that have fought and died, for farm workers to have justice, right? For women to have the right to vote, for the LGBT community to be treated with dignity. That is a legacy that I don't take for granted. And I think voters are seeing that we need a champion, right, for working people. And it fills me with joy that they see somebody like myself that can do that for them. Not for them, but with them.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It would be, journalistically, objectively speaking, not, picking a candidate, but to have Latino representation in that fifth district would be amazing, right? Because it's just not something that we've had before, and it's, or recently, and so it would be definitely a big switch, and it'd be some representation there that we're not getting to some degree. I'm going to throw this one at you because after I interviewed Corey Bantolin, someone said, "Oh, Josh, you should have asked him about um, Santa Maria River flooding." And I was like, I don't know anything about that, you know? And they said, well, you know, it's a big issue and the safety and the hazards. And so I didn't give you a heads up there, but can you talk a little bit about public safety, right? You know, the Santa Ynez or the Santa Maria River over flooding. What is your view on public safety? Because a lot of times people hear, oh, he's against you know, ICE. They're gonna write you off as being like anti-law enforcement or anti-public safety. And we know there's a very big difference in the law enforcement that we see with sheriff's deputies and then these people that they're hiring as, you know, ICE officers. But can you talk a little about the flooding issue and sort of your view on public safety, which certainly, you know, is an issue everywhere?
Absolutely. I have great respect, right, for our law enforcement officers because the majority of them are here to do the right thing, right? They want to protect our families. I also think we need to be honest and know that the public trust, right, in some of our law enforcement has also waned, right? We saw that with the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, right? We see that in working class communities, even here in Santa Maria, right? There's been cases of deaths, right, at the hands of our local law enforcement. And I think that there needs to be more investment, right, in training, right, in cultural proficiency, for example. And so I actually am excited about partnering with the sheriff's office, with our firefighters, all the people, right, that keep our families safe, because I know that that's what they want as well, right? Um, one of the really painful things is that our immigrant communities, when they are under attack by ICE, they are less likely to report crime when it happens. They are less likely to report domestic violence when it happens. And so, you know, I have, you know, a history of bringing coalitions together. I am not afraid to have courageous conversations, right, with our community, with our law enforcement, with our community to say, hey, there's been breaches of trust, but how can we rebuild that trust? How can we gain that trust? And it does have to do, you were alluding to diversity, right? Like it's important, right, that the officers in our community also look like us and talk like us, right? Because many of them, unfortunately, are monolingual. And it's important, right, that we invest in that. I recently read an article about an indigenous, you know, cop that we have here in Santa Maria community, and how people like, you know, line up, right, seeing somebody that can communicate with them in an authentic way. And we need to invest in more of that as well. When it comes to our infrastructure, right, and flooding and things like that, the county has the opportunity to invest resources in emergency preparedness, right? And that's why it's so important that we be mindful with our budget. Do we want to spend our money expanding the North County Jail, right? Or do we want to spend our money on emergency preparedness? Do we want to spend our money on the Santa Maria to Guadalupe Trail, which will be a green space, right? Which will, you know, allow people to invest in their health and their well-being, right? We know that research supports that. Or are we going to invest that money, you know, in you know, in things that are going to, you know, harm our community, such as that jail? I think that money could be better spent, right? We need to be really mindful about our budgets to make sure that, you know, there's no fraud in our budgets as well, right? That's really key. And that's why I think it's important to invest in things like neutral parties, like auditors, right? People that are referred to as like chief safety officers, right? Because nobody knows the budget than the people that live it. And my leadership style is I don't pretend to have all the answers. What makes me effective is I bring people to the table that are often excluded. And I want to make sure that we have the translation services available, right? Because how are people going to engage with our county if everything is in English, right? I remember seeing a supervisor meeting where a Spanish interpretation wasn't even available. That to me blows my mind. How is that possible in a county that has so many Spanish speaking people? As a school board member, since I've been on there, and hopefully even before me, we've had interpretation not just in Spanish, but in Mixteco as well, so that the majority of our families have access to participate in this democracy. So I'm excited about finding ways with the state, with the federal government to advocate for the people of the fifth district in Guadalupe and Santa Maria, because our communities deserve better, and I'm excited to engage in that fight with you.
Yeah. Well, that's great, Ricardo. We're about time, you know, and I really appreciate you spending, you know, an hour sort of just talking about your candidacy and your platform. And there's so much stuff going on that we could talk about. I just going to give you the last word here. You know, just like speak to voters. Why should they support you? Why should they vote for you for this office? It's a, you know, to be fair, there's 3 qualified candidates in different ways, right? It's really like, what are you looking for? You're looking for, you know, some institutional candidate. You're looking for somebody from the community who has served. Maybe there's a little bit more conservatives, more aligned with the third candidate. People have choices, right? As opposed to for years, no one running against Lavanino. So it's an important election. So, I'll give you the last word here before we wrap up. Um, why Ricardo Valencia?
Thank you. My community has seen my work, and are proud, of the result. I would not be running for this office if people in my community didn't encourage me to do so. I believe strongly that leadership should be one where if the community asks you to step up, that's when you consider it. I see too many eager beavers out there, people that claim to be the solution to the revolution, right? People that are like, "Hey, I'm the best candidate." Well, why? Well, because I think I'm the best candidate. That's not me. And what's indicative of that is that I'm the North County Leader of the Year, in 2025. That means that community leaders in this community came together and nominated me for that position and that honor, I should say, right? And it's funny because when I received the award at that celebration last year, I kind of thought I was kind of done in a sense, right? In the sense of like, hey, I got this leadership award. That means I kind of made it. Maybe I could step back. And on the contrary, my community said, no, Ricardo, this means you got to step up even more. And I don't take that trust lightly. As a school board member, I've earned the lead award with my school board team, which means that we've invested in equity for our students. That means that we provide resources where they're needed most and make difficult decisions based on what's best for students in our community. As a teacher here in this community for over 15 years, this community has trusted me with their most sacred, with their most sacred trust, which is our children, right? Our young people. That trust I do not take lightly. And I'm so honored that so many people in my community have said, thank you, Ricardo, for stepping up to run for office. We need more people like you. We don't need career politicians, running for office. We've had that. We don't need people that are Republicans, but then they're independents, right? But then they claim to be in the middle, right? We don't need candidates that are neutral when it comes to ICE. I heard one of my opponents say, oh, there's good and bad with ICE. I'm like, what? Like ICE is killing people. Are you cool with that? Like, no way. I agree with the phrase that you can't be neutral on a moving train. That means if you're on top of a train and it's moving fast, you're going to make a decision, right? You jump or don't jump, right? And right now, our country is in a crisis. But I am so proud that so many good people of goodwill are coming together from different faiths, from different colors, from different incomes. We see that at the No Kings marches, for example, challenging what this Trump and federal administration is doing. I offer a different vision of that, right? I offer an alternative to that, a progressive vision, right? That we can support women's rights. We can support LGBT rights. We can support working families. Like, we don't have to fight for the crumbs. We can all share in the abundance that our county and our world has to offer. So I'm excited to do this work with you all. I asked the voters for their vote, because, I come from a working class community, but as a union member, as a proud union teacher, I know what it's like to live on the opposite side of that. And I want privileges of access to healthcare, access to homeownership for everyone, and not just for a few of us. So I really appreciate you, Josh, for the opportunity, right, to share this message with the community. And I ask that if this message inspires you, to please visit valenciaforsupervisor.com. That's where you could like donate if you if you have the capacity, because these campaigns are ridiculously expensive. But everything helps. If you want to volunteer for the campaign, if you want to spread the word about the campaign, that's how campaigns are won. And I'm so excited to be on this journey with this community. So thank you.
All right, Ricardo, thank you. 5th District, Santa Barbara County Supervisor candidate, and it's been a pleasure. Nice talking to you, and I hope to see you soon in person.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much. You as well. Have a great one. Bye bye.